This episode is brought to you by my Fertility Awareness Mastery online self-study program. Learn fertility awareness from the comfort of your own home at your own pace for a fraction of the cost. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/mastery for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/mastery. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 354. Welcome to the Fertility Friday podcast, your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I'm your host, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I'm the author of The Fifth Vital Sign and the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Journal. I'm a certified fertility awareness educator and holistic reproductive health practitioner with nearly 20 years of experience teaching women to connect to their fifth vital sign through menstrual cycle charting, balancing hormonal health, and optimizing the menstrual cycle without hormones. I'm outspoken about hormonal birth control and its impact on fertility and overall health because you have the right to know how your body works and how artificial hormones disrupt that natural process. I host live coaching programs to help you achieve optimal fertility and health because it's important to have healthy menstrual cycles regardless of whether or not you want to have babies. I'm also a wife and mother of two beautiful boys. I know, I'm a busy girl, but I managed to fit it all in. This podcast is designed to empower you to take full control of your cycles, your fertility, and your overall health. And I'm so excited that you're here with us today. I'm really excited to share today's episode with you. I know I say that a lot because, I aim to only share episodes that I'm really excited about. But in today's episode, I'm sharing my interview with Kate Cordsmeyer. It's interesting how we met because she's an entrepreneur and I was a guest on her podcast. And, we're essentially talking about the menstrual cycle and how it can really help to understand the different phases of your menstrual cycle when you're trying to live life or trying to run a business, those types of things. But what came out of our conversation was Kate's story. Kate came off hormonal birth control and she had an underlying issue of PCOS that was being masked by the hormones. And she describes her journey coming off the pill and normalizing her menstrual cycles. And what you'll learn as you tune in and listen to today's episode is that when Kate initially came off of hormonal contraceptives, her intention was not immediately to conceive. She was actually avoiding pregnancy, but she really wanted to figure out what was happening health-wise. And so in today's episode, we talk about that and some of these challenges about hormonal contraceptives, because again, the hormonal contraceptives didn't cause her underlying issue of PCOS, but they simply masked the issue. And one of the biggest challenges for women who are coming off hormonal contraceptives to try to conceive is that if you happen to have been put on contraceptives because of an underlying issue that the pill is now masking, meaning that when you're on hormonal contraceptives, you're getting a bleed every 28 days, or not, depending on the type. But many, the majority of hormonal contraceptives do give you a regular bleed. And so that can then mask any underlying issues that are preventing the spontaneous ovulation that is required for a normal, healthy cycle. So without further ado, let's jump into today's episode with Kate. And I'm excited to welcome my guest, Kate Cordsmeyer, today to the show. She is a writer, educator, and creative entrepreneur. And after almost a decade as a freelance journalist, she founded Root Revel, a holistic wellness blog with a focus on mind, body, soul health. Once the blog blossomed into a six-figure business, she started the Six-Figure Blog Academy, a digital course dedicated to helping others start their own profitable businesses. And Kate is also the host of the Success with Soul podcast, which is how we met. Her mission is to empower women to create a profitable, purpose-filled online business and build a life of freedom and flexibility without selling their soul. So then the question is, why is Kate on the show today? Because of course, I don't typically talk about entrepreneurship on the podcast, but I met Kate, we did an interview together. And in that interview, we talked about the specific challenges that women have just navigating life and how helpful it can be to understand your menstrual cycle throughout those periods of time. And Kate also has a really compelling just story, I think, like most of us do with our cycles. And so I'm thrilled to have her on the show to chat about it today. So welcome to the show, Kate.
Thanks for having me. I love that I had you on my show and we were like, it's kind of weird to bring somebody to talk about hormones on a business podcast. And now we're saying it's kind of weird to bring somebody to talk about business onto a hormones podcast. But the two are so inextricably linked. And whether you're an entrepreneur or you work for somebody else, or you are a working parent, meaning parenting is the hardest work of all, I think it all applies. So I love it.
Yes, for sure. And I've had so many interesting conversations, as you can imagine, over the years with women in all kinds of different situations. So whether I'm talking to a university student in her early 20s or a high school student in her late teens, or a woman that's had 3 children and is looking for, birth control options, or a high-powered business owner. One of the things that unifies us all is that monthly menstrual cycle, having to navigate how we're going to not get pregnant when we don't want to, how we're going to get pregnant when we want to. And this is across all domains as far as women's lives go. So with that said, I would love to just start by giving you an opportunity to share your own experience with your cycles. So it's kind of an interesting question. It like literally probably only happens here on the Fertility Friday podcast, where the first question is like, so, how old were you when you had your first period? How did that work with your cycles? And how did you manage your fertility and things like that? Kind of let us know the whole story there and kind of leading up to now, which we'll get to as well.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever been asked, especially not publicly, tell me about your first period. So I'm excited to finally answer this question because I feel like people should be talking about it more. And I'm so grateful for your work for that reason. So I do remember my first period. I got it at Thanksgiving, which is actually really interesting because past weekend was Thanksgiving, and I just got my period again for the first time after having 2 kids. So full circle. It was Thanksgiving when I was, I think, 12. And I remember I was so excited because a couple of my friends had gotten theirs already. And it just felt at the time to me like I am a woman now. And, when you're that age, there's something cool about like doing things first or early. And it was like getting your driver's license first or something. I just felt so grown up. Like I have a period. Oh my God. So it was a positive experience for me. And I remember going to my aunt and uncle's house for Thanksgiving and telling my cousin, like, I got my period today. I'm a badass. And my mom gave me the whole spiel about pads and tampons and whatnot. And so it started off positive. I don't really remember a lot about my period until probably later on in high school when I started having really heavy cycles and breaking out a lot. And my mom took me to the gynecologist and they were like, great, you should just go on the pill. And at the time I think I was 16 and I was dating a guy and I was like kind of ready to maybe start having sex too. And so it felt like, yeah, this could actually kill 2 birds with 1 stone. And so I got on the pill and I stayed on it until I was 26. And I came off of the pill at 26 because I was having so many health issues. And it felt like if I didn't know what my body's natural state was without any medication, I had been on some other medication for some digestion issues I was having as well. And it was making things worse. And so I just had this kind of like, come to Jesus. I'm going to go cold turkey. I'm getting off everything. I got to get to the bottom of this. And I don't feel like I could if I'm on something that could be altering my hormones or whatever. I didn't really know much about what the pill was doing at the time. I just knew it didn't feel right to be on it if I wanted to get to the root cause of my issues. So I came off. My body freaked out. I gained a ton of weight. I broke out in horrible, horrible acne. I started having anxiety and panic attacks. My digestion continued to cause problems. And it just felt like kind of everything was going wrong and my body was failing me. And I was in a really bad place. And then I started learning more about my cycle and I started tracking it and kind of paying attention to what was happening in a way that I obviously had never even considered doing in the past. And everything started getting better. And, there's a lot of specific things I did and that I'm happy to share. But I think the biggest thing was just paying attention to it and using it as like a barometer for my health. And that's what led me to start Root Revel, which was my holistic wellness blog, was all about finding natural remedies for curing and treating some hormonal and digestion issues, mental health and stuff. And a lot of it really just came back to my period.
Wow. Well, that is really fascinating. I love asking questions like this because then you get to take us on a journey of a good 10 plus years of your life. And I think there's a couple things that really stand out to me. One is that it was your intuition that led you to kind of question if the pill could be related, or at least to know enough to say that as long as I'm on this and it's affecting my hormones, I don't really know the true picture of what's happening. So in order for me to actually see what's happening, taking a break from this thing might be helpful. I also think that, again, intuitively, that kind of starting to track and understanding, okay, well, this isn't normal. So what can I do to fix it? Because as you know, our medical system basically says the pill fixes it and doesn't really offer a lot of alternatives. And so the biggest challenge with that approach is that when you do want to fix the root, it's up to you to really figure out what's going to work. And another piece of your story, of course, is that this whole experience with your cycle led you to change your kind of business orientation. And I think this happens to a lot of women who listen to this podcast as well. A lot of my clients have kind of gone on to change their professional orientation, to get different training, to go into a completely different field because they just realized what a huge impact that the cycle and having a healthy cycle and healing an unhealthy cycle can have on your perspective and everything. So those are a few things that stood out. And I wanted to ask you if you could share just a little bit about that journey of kind of like, because, a lot of people would call that experience post-birth control syndrome, being the rebounding. Now, I don't necessarily use those terms per se, but I mean, for many women coming off the pill, it corresponds with like your body kind of sorting it out. And so for a lot of women, it does look like acne or kind of a rebound of symptoms, but it's like a rebound before it gets better. So it's like it gets worse before it gets better because your body is literally like sorting itself out. Hormones are being produced that weren't before. Things are changing. Some things are improving and some things seem to be worsening. So take us through that, and I guess just how you wound up to the place where you are no longer feeling that way.
Yeah. Well, it was hard because, like you said, Western medicine, I mean, that's what I was raised on. And when I went to my doctors and I said, I went off the pill and my body is losing it, like everything is going wrong, but I know that the answer isn't to go back on the pill. They tried to convince me otherwise. I had several gynecologists and gastroenterologists, and I mean, tons of people. Well, actually, okay, that's a separate story. I'm going to get to that in a second. The gynecologist said, well, are you ready to have children? And I said, no, not yet. I would like to have kids one day. And she's like, well, just so you know, it's probably going to be an uphill battle and there's probably going to be miscarriage involved. But until you're ready to have kids, just get back on the pill. And I just was like, I wanted to like report her to the board or something. Like, what can I do about this? Because this just feels so wrong. She was not listening to me. I said, my mom has PCOS. I looked up the symptoms. A lot of them are in line with what I have. And she said, well, we can run a hormone panel and see. So she did. And then she looked at it and said, no, everything's fine. I would just get back on the pill. And because I'm a journalist at heart and a researcher and a learner, so I came home and was like, I have no idea what these levels mean, but I'm going to Google them and see what I can find. And it was almost like, how did this trained physician think that these levels were okay when it was so clear, even on like Quest Diagnostics, like their ranges, which are obviously outdated and very broad, even they were saying these levels are way out of range. And So it was so bizarre, and I was so angry that nobody was listening to me, and they kept just acting like the pill would fix it. And it was clear, like, well, the pill, yeah, it fixed it. I had these issues when I was 16, and I stopped having them when I got on the pill, but they came back as soon as I went off, and way worse than before. And so again, it was my intuition just telling me this is not the way. This is just a band-aid. This is not going to solve the problem. And then it was funny because after I went off and then I started paying attention to my cycles and stuff, I went back to my gastroenterologist and I said, I came off the pill and my digestion it got worse at first, but it's really improved drastically. And she said, oh yeah, the pill actually has been proven to mess with our guts. And a lot of women find relief when they get off the pill. I was like, why didn't we start with that? I've been coming to you for a year and you knew I was on the pill. Why didn't you say, hey, maybe we should try going off the pill? It could be causing a gut imbalance. So I was pissed at everybody. And thankfully, I found some amazing books that helped me introduce me to functional medicine and, more holistic remedies. And so I found an integrative doctor and finally found somebody who really was listening to me and then working with me to get to the root cause and treat that rather than just mask everything. I'm not sure now. I've gone on a tangent and I'm like, what was the original question? But
well, I have a comment and then another question. So it works out. So what's interesting is that, there's a lot of evidence to show that women who have gut issues, whether it's IBS or Crohn's, that the pill has been shown to worsen it because we know that the pill disrupts the gut microbiome. So this is not, although it's anecdotal when you have your own experience, it's not hard to find that data. And I've certainly quoted some of those studies where they're showing this link, meaning if you have, it's hard to say, like, does the pill cause you to have IBS? Or if you just have a propensity towards IBS, does it make it worse? Right? So there's a lot of questions that we could ask, but it doesn't make it better. So for women who have either predisposition or who have gut issues, it certainly can worsen it. And that's shown very clearly in the literature. So I feel like that alongside a lot of the other very common symptomologies and things like that. And as a side note, I've spoken to, many, many women who went on the pill and started getting yeast infections. And then the doctor doesn't say like, oh, did you just get on the pill? We know that the pill can cause, dysbiosis. They'll put her on antifungals and then she'll get a bacterial infection and then she'll get antibacterial and then it'll just swing back and forth like until either it goes away or she gets fed up.
I'm like, what's in it for these doctors to keep us all on the pill? Because it seems like they have some stake in the game, the way that they push it down your throat so much and then act as if it's like the only medication in the world without side effects, when in fact there are so many known side effects. And it made me really question and like lose faith in the conventional healthcare system in our country for sure.
Yeah, I've talked about this. I'm sure anyone who's like a regular listener is like, oh, here she goes. But like, wait for it. But no, it's really interesting because then that's the next logical question. Why is this the way that we handle it? And so I've interviewed a number of doctors. And when I'm asking questions about, okay, what did you learn in med school? How is the menstrual cycle taught in relation to the pill? Like, why is it that the pill is the solution to everything? And it's because that's how it's presented in medical school. And again, I didn't go to medical school. So this is coming from my interviews with doctors, which I'll link to the show notes page so you can listen and make up your own mind. But I've interviewed so many doctors and this is what they say. They say that in medical school, they're presented with, the menstrual cycle. It's supposed to be 28 days, et cetera, et cetera. And then if it's ever outside of that range, the pill is the solution. And the pill is the solution to every possible medical issue. And
try the pill.
Exactly. So I would say that you can't really blame the doctor because if you think about what is allopathic medicine, what is Western medicine, it's basically problem A, we need to provide drug B. And this is the actual modality. So the modality was never intended or designed to find the root cause and fix that. So that's why when you had to go to an integrative doctor to get to the root cause, because that's the type of, like, they have a different education process
Right.
that they go through. So I think that's one thing. But then the other thing is that the pill is something like a $22 billion to growing to $30 billion, industry. And so, and who funds medical school training and things like that. So if you are looking at like who's getting what out of it, well, it's a lot of money for these drug companies to have millions, I think 100 million plus women worldwide to be on the pill. So that's just a little aside.
To throw another like kind of half-formed idea that has come to me recently, because I actually got the copper IUD implanted maybe a couple months ago, and it hurt like hell to get put in. And I came home just screaming about the patriarchy and how I was like, of course, there's not a single method of birth control that puts the burden on men. And yeah, you could kind of argue condoms, but I won't even go down that path. But like, I think the patriarchy is also like largely responsible. Again, I haven't fully formed my like opinion or thought exactly into something eloquent, but I'm like, there's something there too about, well, the pill puts the burden and responsibility on women, and to uphold that status quo, that's part of it. It's got to be.
What did it feel like when you had the IUD inserted?
Okay, so it felt like I just gave birth 6 months ago, so this is pretty fresh. And it felt like the most intense contraction that lasted, normally a contraction lasts like 30, 60 seconds or whatever, and then you have a break, and it's horrible, but it ends. And this was like 7 minutes of the entire time they were implanting it. It felt like the most intense contraction, and it did not let up until it was done. So it was 7 full minutes of just excruciating, like the whole time. And when they showed afterwards, I said, can you show me what you did to cause that feeling? Because it is not what I expected it to feel like. And she showed me this. I know they can't see me, but this like foot long pair of tweezers basically that had these spikes at the end. And she said that they go up and they spike your cervix and they pull it down and then put this thing in there, and then they release it. So the whole time that it was, I don't know the word to use, but like the whole time that they had it in and then pulling my cervix down, it was awful. And nobody told me. I mean, afterwards, I called some of my friends that had IUDs and was like, thanks a lot, because if you had told me that that's what I had to expect, I don't know that I would have done it. And especially so close to giving birth. And yeah, I came home screaming about the patriarchy and how it was such bullshit that I had to go through all of the pregnancy stuff and all of the childbirth and all of the nursing, and men can't even worry about getting us pregnant.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're in the right place for this discussion. But I mean, of course, that's a big part of it. Science and medicine was based on the study of the male body. Right. And, they don't even, a lot of medications that come out are only studied on men. Mm-hmm. And even when they're doing animal studies, they'll study male animals because the female cycle is thought to be too complex or whatever. And so they don't study. And it's highly problematic for women. One excellent example is heart attacks, because men and women present very differently with heart attacks. And so up until fairly recently, within the last few decades, doctors weren't necessarily trained to identify the different ways that men and women present with heart attacks. So many women would end up obviously in much more serious condition if people weren't identifying the heart attack. So anyways, yes to the patriarchy. And I don't know if this is going to make you feel better or worse, but I've interviewed a fair number of women who have had IUDs in my Pill Reality series. And so hormonal and non-hormonal. I've never had personally an IUD. And, I typically am working with women after they've come off of birth control. So it's not the primary practice. But one of the things that agitated, I don't know if I could say surprised, but certainly agitated me, is that this is one of the questions I've started to ask as just a default question when I'm interviewing a woman who has used a copper or regular hormonal IUD before. The insertion pain is real, and I don't have a scientific stat for you today, but it's a high percentage of women that experience significant pain. And the piss off is that doctors have the ability to numb the cervix. They have the ability to do that, but they don't. And there's kind of this prevailing attitude that women don't have nerve endings in the cervix. And it's just like a small pain or whatever. I would imagine that if they were inserting a device into the penis, that men would get numbing agents. But it's just it's just a hunch.
Just a hunch. And like, shocker, there isn't ever really a time that men are having anything inserted into their penis. You know, I mean, catheters aside, but it's like there's no, what's the word? I don't know, just burden on men. And yeah, I think, you know, I go to a midwife practice, and I was very intentional about not having anything hormonal as part of my birth control. But the irony of all of this is that I was told that I was going to have a really difficult time getting pregnant, and I may not even be able to, and I would probably miscarry. And, you know, my fertility journey was just going to be really difficult. And another story that I'm sure we'll get into is how I'm so glad that I healed my body naturally without using the pill or anything synthetically hormone based, so that I could get pregnant easily and keep the pregnancy, which I did twice on my first try. And that's part of why I now have the copper IUD, was because I'm like, turns out I'm super fertile. And so I need to be like, I just don't have the capacity right now to be so diligent in tracking everything to make sure that I absolutely couldn't get pregnant at a certain time. I was just like, 2 kids is good for me right now. I've got 2 under 2. And so I've got to find a non-hormonal solution that helps me not get pregnant, when most of my journey was in fear of not being able to get pregnant. So funny how the turntables.
Well, and you mentioned that when you were going through kind of your post-pill stuff, there were certain symptoms that you had before that the pill had obviously taken away. And then when you came off, and you mentioned PCOS. So did you have some of the classic PCOS cycle-related issues, like long irregular cycles? Could you share a little bit about what some of those symptoms were that made you concerned that you may have PCOS?
Yeah, absolutely. So it oscillated my hormone levels. I started getting my hormone levels tracked every month for like a year or 2. And in the beginning, I had really high AMH levels and was high in like the male androgens and those hormones. Then I became estrogen dominant. And so I had really high estrogen and low progesterone. So there were some things that were just sort of like, from a scientific, like factual base, these are what's happening with my hormone levels. But symptom wise, my cycles, I started off and it was like, they almost wanted me to take the pill that forces your period to start. Now I can't even remember what that was called, but thankfully I didn't do that. But it took maybe 2 or 3 months for me to get my first period after coming off the pill. And then from there, it was like at least 6 months of having 45 to 60 day cycles. It took a while for me to get them down to be both shorter and more regular, because sometimes it would be like, oh, I had a 22-day cycle, but then the next month I would have a 63-day cycle, and there was no consistency with it. So there was definitely the irregularness of it. I wasn't somebody that really struggled with cramping. So that was one reason that I also considered the copper IUD, because I know that some women who do have cramping, anyway, that's another story. But so definitely long irregular cycles. And then my period sometime would last for over a week. And then sometime, like, it was all just across the board. After about 2 years, I started having very consistent regular cycles of 5-day periods with 32 days in between. So I was able to get to a pretty consistent place. And then that was the case for several more years until I started getting pregnant and having kids.
So I just want to interject for a second, because for women who are listening, often women who find this podcast some women are at a stage where they're looking for birth control, or maybe they had an issue with hormonal contraception. And so they're planning that, and there's no kind of urgency with regards to having the normal, like having everything ready for pregnancy. But of course, there are other women who discover this podcast in the midst of their fertility journey. And so hearing like, okay, I was able to normalize my cycles. They started out being like 45, 60 days in between periods, and everything was kind of all over the place. But after about 2 years, it sorted out. So for a lot of women, they're going to be like, 2 years.
Yeah. But that's exactly, and this is what came up on my podcast that you were on, was that thank God I did it when I did, because I wasn't in a rush to get it regular. I wasn't in a rush to get pregnant and have a baby. And what if I had waited to come off the pill until I was ready, and then it took 2 years? Like that would have been so devastating. And my doctor would have definitely proven herself right if I had stayed on the pill, because I probably would have miscarried having super low progesterone, and I probably would have had trouble even getting pregnant in the first place. And so it does take a while. But every woman's different. I've also had friends who come off the pill and just get right back to it. But I think that my thing was that I always had PCOS. I just didn't know it. And so it was like having to treat this thing that's been going on, this imbalance, for over a decade, and it was going to take longer. And I'm so grateful that my intuition was telling me when it did, because I just feel like I saved myself and my husband from a lot of heartache of trying to heal my body and get pregnant at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, this is essentially one of the reasons why I was inspired to invite you on the show, because it's a real kind of life case study, if you will, of how this really looks. And so there are times when people will say that I just bash the pill, or that I'm anti-pill, or whatever. And I feel like your experience helps to clarify all of that. Because when you're talking about the pill, so I've worked with women in a similar situation to yourself who come off the pill and they have these long cycles and basically the signs of PCOS. The pill did not cause your PCOS.
No.
And this is exactly the point. There are other women who I work with who had their first period, their cycles were not really an issue. Maybe they get on the pill between ages like 19 and 20 something when they're ready to have sex, but their cycles were pretty normal and consistent and regular, and they weren't put on the pill the minute after they had their first period. So their cycles were able to mature. And I always use the example of, when I first got my breast buds, I didn't have breasts that next month. It took a couple of years before my breasts fully matured and turned into what they were going to turn into. And same thing with the cycle. And so the message here, like kind of like the takeaway cliff notes, is that every woman is not going to have the same experience. The pill does not cause these fertility issues per se, but what it does is it masks them. And so I often say that if you're on the pill and you're wanting to conceive at some point in the future, if you have the ability to do that, then it makes sense to consider coming off of it 18 months to 2 years ahead of time. And that to some women is like, what is she talking about? 18 months to 2 years. Even some practitioners are like, that's just too much. And so then the caveat is like at least a year if you're able to do it. But if you had cycle issues beforehand, if you were put on the pill because your cycles were irregular, or if you were put on the pill because you stopped cycling altogether, the pill didn't fix it. And so that puts you in the category of greater risk. So you would have been in that category of greater risk because you did have some cycle irregularities and different challenges that were coming up before. But like you said, you didn't know that you fell into the PCOS category. And we don't know how long it would have taken you to conceive. But just looking at the cycle as a vital sign, when the cycle normalized, that also aligned with, well, you tell us, the symptoms that you had in the beginning, like outside of the cycle itself, but the symptoms that you had, like what were, like, did it correlate? Like when the cycle normalized, were you normalized?
Oh yeah. Then I was symptom free, and I've lived mostly symptom free since I got my period normalized and regulated and my hormones in a balanced state. And everything in my life got better when I did that. And I struggled with a lot of mental health stuff. I mean, I still do struggle with some of that, but I can tell when I am out of sync that that's when it starts happening. And I have no digestion issues anymore. And I have just sort of normal skin. Really, my complaint with my skin now is that I have scarring from when I did have bad acne. But yeah, I have friends that, I mean, I just had this conversation with a friend a couple weeks ago where she just got married and she wants a baby like yesterday. But she's on the pill. And I said, well, you like get off. Get off. And she's like, well, I think we'll wait until we're like officially ready to start trying. I'm like, please don't. And she said, well, I don't want to come off because off the pill, I have horrific periods and terrible PMS. Like, that's exactly why you should come off now. And, she heard it as, are you saying there's something wrong with me? And I was like, well, yes and no. I mean, it's not something wrong with you, but there's something going on in your body. And I love your book for that reason, because our period is exactly that, like a barometer of our health. And I'm like, regardless, I mean, it's going to be devastating to you if there's something wrong or not, but it's treatable, but not while you're on the pill. So let's start the process now, because the problem is going to exist whether you start it when you're exactly ready to get pregnant or not. But I think there is something so ingrained in us that like, no, the pill is what's keeping me from having these problems.
I wanted to pop in with a quick message from today's sponsor, Audible. Did you know that you can listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free when you sign up for a 30-day trial with Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible for details. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible. Now let's jump back into today's episode. Well, similar to how Advil often will keep you from having a headache, or, this is the way of Western medicine, which is to reduce the symptoms. And somehow we've been convinced that that takes care of the issue.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with managing symptoms. As someone who experienced horrific period pain for, years in my early days, from the first period, I'm anti-pain. I don't think we should have to deal with that kind of stuff. But at the same time, we have to have that understanding that if you had really horrible periods and really, really bad PMS, that's not normal. And it's a sign that there's something going on below. And anybody who had certain cycle challenges, it is a good idea to consider that in terms of when you're planning to come off hormonal contraception. In an ideal world, when you have the time, the lead time, it is a good idea. And it makes complete logical sense. Like, who would disagree? If you have the lead time and you have the ability to come off the pill, let your cycles normalize, identify any issues that are outstanding and actually address those, having ideally a minimum of 3 normal cycles before you can, and I'm talking like ideal, perfect world scenario here, but that would actually be ideal. It would be ideal to sort it out and to get yourself to the point that you have 3 cycles that fall within the normal parameters in a row before you try to conceive. Now, I'm not trying to say we need to get into perfectionism, because there's another argument to be made that your body will conceive when you're ready. And if you conceive and you carry your baby to term, it means you were healthy enough to do that. So there's 2 things that I'm holding in my hands here. But at the same time, it makes logical sense that we want to be healthy. It's not you as a woman, as a person, you deserve to be healthy. So one last question before we switch gears a little bit. And I think this is probably what a lot of people are wondering. So I think it's helpful in your case that to kind of illustrate that it wasn't overnight, and certainly you had to work at it for a while. But looking back, what were some of the biggest factors in helping you to regulate and normalize your cycle, in helping to reduce and get rid of the acne, and also some of the digestive issues, just kind of like the biggest factors?
Yeah. For a long time, I felt like it was my diet. And what I realized is that actually might have helped in the beginning, and it certainly gave me a sense of control. Like, oh, if I eat these things and I don't eat these things, I'm doing something when I feel so powerless to fix this problem. But it ultimately ended up leading to a very unhealthy relationship with food. So I don't like to lead with that, because even though I think that there are some foods that can be really nourishing for your body, and I now take the approach of more like adding in more good rather than trying to take away foods, get people into a state of deprivation or restriction and dieting. Diet culture is not my thing. But what I found is that self-care and really managing my stress was the biggest factor. And I think that when I was eating healthy, I was also taking better care of myself as a whole. I was slowing down to take the time to prepare healthy meals. So it wasn't so much like what I was eating, it was more my mentality about the food and about everything that kind of went around it. I also feel like some of it is like probably things women have heard a million times before, but it's just true. Yoga and meditation and therapy were like weekly. I did at least one of and acupuncture. I did at least one of the 4 of those things every single day. And now that's all I do. And now I eat whatever the heck I want and I don't worry about it. And none of my symptoms have come back, which has kind of been proof to me that it's really more about taking good care of myself than any specific food. Along with that, I will say what I did cut out was more of like toxic chemicals in my life and in my environment. A lot of things that we use in our shampoos and face wash and deodorants and just things that toothpaste, like everyday products, have hormone disruptors in them. And so getting rid of those and really relying on not necessarily natural as in non-chemical, but just non-toxic and products that are made without parabens and other known hormone disruptors was also really huge. I definitely relied on supplementation a lot. I think one thing that became clear when I started doing a lot of my lab work, and regular lab work, I will say, was a big part, because then it wasn't guessing like where I was deficient or where I needed support. It was, okay, you're low in vitamin D. Let's add some vitamin D supplementation. Vitamin D and vitamin B deficiencies are super common in women with PCOS. And so supplementing with those, I tried everything across the board, like doing different adaptogens. I loved like mushroom coffees and ashwagandha and reishi and things like that. Some other supplements that I took were like Vitex and evening primrose oil and oh gosh, I don't know. There were a few that anesthitol, some different things. And I feel like those each kind of helped get me to like the next level, but they weren't things that I needed to take lifelong. Like now I don't take any of that stuff. And I just kind of take better care of myself overall. So I would say the biggest thing for me is self-care, slowing down, being present, and being aware of your cycle. I think cycle tracking was the most powerful thing I did.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for taking through that. I think it's always, I've had many conversations with clients where they try something and it works really well for them. And for other women, it's not that's going to be the thing for them. It's something else. So I feel like there's always room for our stories of what we do to support ourselves. But for all the women listening who are struggling with PCOS, your journeys may look similar in some ways and different in some ways, because there may be certain things that really work well for you that for yourself, Kate, weren't really the biggest factors. So I always want to say that, because I've certainly had conversations with clients who are like, oh, I did this thing and everyone with this problem should do this. And it's like, well, I've had clients who do that and it doesn't necessarily like affect them in the same way.
Right. And that's why I think I say like using your actual lab work, because if I have high estrogen and low progesterone, but you have high testosterone, then the same things aren't going to work for us. And so along with regular lab work, I think finding a practitioner who is versed in women's cycles and women's health and not just going to push a pill, like somebody who can really work with you and recommend things that are specific to your body is really important. And I mean, I spent a lot of money on my doctors and other acupuncture and chiropractic and things like that during this time. And every penny was worth it, but it did take some money and some time up front of regular doctor's visits. Like there was no annual checkup. It was like every month I was in there working with them to get to this root cause and heal.
Yeah, I mean, this is the tough part about it, because the menstrual cycle in and of itself is reflecting what's happening in your body. And when the menstrual cycle is significantly off base or outside of the normal range, it's not the menstrual cycle per se. The menstrual cycle is the messenger, right? It's like, don't shoot the messenger. But the actual issue is the health concern. So the menstrual cycle can help you to identify that it's there, but rectifying some of these health concerns, again, that Western medicine does not have a cure for PCOS. Like it's a syndrome, meaning that, it's a collection of symptoms, and women can certainly improve their cycle lengths overall, and they can certainly gear their body to a more regular, normal cycle. But when you have that disposition, it's like you always have it, and you learn to manage it. You learn what contributes to it. You learn what makes it worse, and then you deal with it. Right. And that's something that can take time, a bit of trial and error, like you said, support specifically to help you with that. And of course, another theme that I'll just kind of point out is that you did go to doctors who told you, right, that there was nothing you could do, and this is just going to be hard, and you're going to have a hard time. Like you're
just getting older. This is what one told me. You're just getting older, and you're just going to have to eat less and exercise more.
And that's unfortunately, because if you look at the literature about PCOS, so there's an acknowledgement that not a woman's weight is not necessarily like directly correlated with PCOS, meaning that some women who have PCOS are overweight, but many women who have PCOS are not. And so I've also spoken with clients who were on the slim side, who literally had all of the textbook. So it's 2 out of 3, the polycystic ovaries, the hyperandrogen issues, plus the irregular cycle. And so, I'm looking at our chart. The chart says, okay, totally irregular, really long cycles. She's got all kinds of hair all over the place that shouldn't be there. So, those are 2 of the 3, like you fit I'm not diagnosing anybody, but I'm saying go to your doctor, get them to test your testosterone now, because you've got these symptoms. But the doctors are looking at, like, kind of, she walks in the office, she's not overweight. Oh, it can't be PCOS. So I think
that was totally me too, because I did gain a lot of weight, but it's all relative. Like, I'm 5'6", I was 130 pounds. I went off the pill, I was 145 pounds. I gained that weight in like 6 weeks. So it was really fast, and there was no reason for it other than going off the pill. But 5'6" and 145 pounds, I walked into a doctor's office and they're like, you're thin, you're fine, you don't have this. So I'm glad you said that, because was definitely my experience.
Yeah, I mean, it just goes to show, like, this is not specific to you, even though it can feel like it. These are not specific. Like, all I can say is, after almost 20 years of having these conversations with women, all in my, and it's in it. Of course, it's within my work, but it's also within my life. There are times when I'm not on the podcast, and where I'm not working with clients, and in the world with friends, and in all kinds of different situations. And these experiences unite the vast majority of women. The experience of going to the doctor, not really being listened to, having your symptoms minimized, having to fight to get someone to listen to you, having to go to several doctors to get someone to like actually pay attention to what you're saying, having to understand that you have to go to different modalities if you want that root cause type medicine. And so I just wanted to share that kind of thought about your story, because it's not easy. Your cycles did not magically just get better. And you have given us a window into the amount of time and work. And it doesn't mean that it's exactly like you said. Some women come off the pill and they just start cycling again. Those are women for whom the pill is not masking an underlying issue, right? But I think this conversation just gives a picture of what this can actually look like. And that's why if you've just come off the pill and it's been 3 months, and of course it feels like an eternity, there is hope, but it can take some time and effort to get the right support team around you and to take the time that it needs to figure out what your body needs in order to normalize. So I wanted to end just on a more positive note, I guess. One of the things that we talked about when we met in our first interview together was how understanding your cycle can help you in your day-to-day life and organizing your work and things like that. And I would love for you to speak to that a little bit. So you're an entrepreneur, so am I. Many women who are listening may also be entrepreneurs, but it ranges. So some are working various jobs, various professions. Some are working for themselves. Some are running around with children, trying to organize all of that, parents. So share with us how paying attention to your cycle has helped you maintain balance and anything else that can be really helpful for all the listeners who are kind of sorting it all out.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked this question. So just as you were talking about how men are the ones who are studied and tested for drugs and different things like that, our work life as a culture is built around a man's biological clock, which is 24 hours and the same every day. And obviously, women's cycles do not work the same way. And what I have found is that trying to do certain tasks when you're on your period versus when you're ovulating is kind of like waking a man up in the middle of the night and saying, go perform your best work. And so I now try, it's not to say there's a balance here, because you can take it to that perfectionism level and say, okay, so I'm never going to do anything, visibility or public facing when I'm on my period. I'm only going to lay in bed. It's like, okay, well, our culture is definitely not set up for that either. But there's a balance. And some of it is just being aware. Okay, like I'm on my period today. So ideally, I maybe wouldn't be a guest on a podcast when I'm on my period. However, I know that. And so I've built into my day, okay, after this, I'm going to do some yoga. I'm going to rest and take a break, and I'm going to refuel. Whereas if I was ovulating, I might like have back-to-back interviews and just be out and about full of energy and not looking to just like rest. So I've just found that certain activities are better if I can schedule them to coincide with different phases of my cycle, when I have more energy, when I am feeling more forward facing, and vice versa, that it's just not as hard. I don't have to push as hard and fight so hard to get things done. Things are easier. They take less time because I'm naturally in that headspace, basically. So I've really found cycle syncing, lining up my work schedule as much as I can within reason with my period, has been really powerful.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love the example that you gave of waking up a man in the middle of the night and asking him to do his best work, because that is so true. And I mean, I also love the balance that you shared with regards to that, because it's not to say you can't do it. I mean, you can do whatever you want. And there are women who run marathons when they have their periods. And I used that example in the Fifth Vital Sign. I was like, you can do that and I will cheer you on. But I'm cheering you on partially because I'm like, she is amazing. I am not doing that.
Yeah. No marathons happening on this end either.
Maybe like day 4, but like not day 1 or day 2. Absolutely not. And that's it's not because I couldn't. I feel like it's as I get older, I have less patience. I just need to do what is best for me, because life is better when you do that. So
and we talked about this too, because I think some of it is also, a lot of entrepreneurs and just women are high achieving, and giving yourself the permission to rest more has been very life-changing. And I don't always follow it. And I struggle with it too. But when I can say, okay, this is what's happening in your body this week, maybe don't overdo it. Like, it's okay to you will get up off the couch again. I know we kind of made that joke of like, you can feel like, oh, if I give myself this permission to rest, I'll never get off the couch again. It's like, it's not going to happen. Don't catastrophize. You will. even if you laid on the couch for your full cycle, then, once all those hormones start rising again, you're going to want to get off the couch and you're going to want to go do something. So I think just kind of trusting my body, giving it that permission, and then just having that awareness, even when I don't always do the thing that corresponds with where I'm at, just being aware has been really powerful.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the topics that came up in one of my recent interviews with Elisa Vitti was the idea of thinking of your cycle or thinking of how you organize your life or your work or whatever it is in terms of a cycle instead of in terms of a day. So instead of every day being the same, it's like if you think about your productivity over the course of a month, you can give yourself a couple of days when you're not feeling it, when your energy is down because of the cyclical reality of having a menstrual cycle, and recognize that you'll make up for it on those days that you're really high energy. And if you start to think of your life in that way and start tracking, and even if you pay attention to those things, like if you wanted to, you could chart your productivity with your cycle, depending on the app that you're using or whatever the case. I still chart on paper. So I have certain things, like I'm working on a book. So I have writing ticked off and I check when I've been productive and see how it aligns with my cycle, just out of curiosity, really. But you can do those kinds of things and stop feeling guilty about needing to take a break sometimes. I think that's like the biggest.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Well, this conversation has been so great. I really appreciate you for coming on the show and sharing so many intimate details of your cycles and your history. It's so powerful, though, and helpful. I'm sure you can appreciate how powerful and helpful it is for women to, first of all, hear, like, I'm not alone. There's other women who are experiencing the exact same thing. It's not unique. And this is one of the things I love about having a podcast, because I have conversations like what we had on air with women all the time. This has literally been my life for 2 decades. Mm-hmm. And so I know that regardless, like, whether you're looking at some high powerful woman in the public eye, or whether you're looking at the mom in the grocery store, we all have stories like this.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yes, it's just what it is. So as we bring our interview to a close, is there any kind of main takeaway you'd want the listeners to take away from everything we've talked about today?
Get off the pill. No. I think it does just come back to me of like just taking care of yourself and recognizing like it's not your fault. There's not something wrong with you. This is the way our culture has been built. This is the way doctors are taught in med school. This is, it's all these things, but that we can reclaim our power, and even just within ourselves, by harnessing the power of our periods. And I text my friends when I got my first period back after 2 kids. I was like, I'm so excited. And they're like, you're crazy. Why would you be happy to get your period? And I'm like, I don't know. There's just this like joy that I have from this connection now to my body. And I think it extends through everything else in my life. So I'm proud to be a woman now. And I feel like I couldn't always say that.
That's amazing. And it made me think of a thing. So I'm like going on a little bit for a moment, if you'll indulge me.
Yeah.
So before we started recording, and we were talking about how you just got your period and it's Thanksgiving and it's very wonderful, and you mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast, I said to you, I was like, and it also just so happens to be the full moon.
Yeah.
And so we were just talking about the cycles and all the, just how you might feel and things like that. And I mean, I certainly have found it interesting over the years to pay attention to see if I'm ovulating or menstruating with the full moon. But it's not something that is this huge part of my charting, but I'll look up in the sky and notice if I happen to be menstruating or ovulating with the moon. But I just wanted to put that out there as well, because when you do pay attention to the moon cycles, you might also notice, like, I don't know if it's, so we're recording this, it's not going to air right away, but we're recording this at an interesting time in the world. And on top of that, it's a full moon. And I certainly felt like I was affected by it. I felt like my energy was a bit shifted. And I know I spoke to a few girlfriends who also felt like their energy was a bit off with the full moon.
Yeah. And it was a lunar eclipse too.
Yeah. Like because we needed that too.
Right.
November 2020, right? Like clearly we didn't need a lunar eclipse, like in addition to everything else. But with that said, I just wanted to throw that out there because it's an interesting part of this world that we live in, that many of us, if not all of us, are affected by these cycles that are kind of outside of our control. I can't control when the moon is full and all that, but it's helpful sometimes when you're charting, and if you're having an off day or whatever, to, you know, look at your chart. But also if you're into this kind of stuff, certainly take a peek at that, because if you do, you might find that there are times when you are affected by some of those other cycles, like the moon cycles and things like that.
Well, and I've been pregnant or nursing for the last 3 years until this weekend, and when I got my period again. So I have only been able to track the moon because I haven't had a cycle to track. So I do think that there is a lot of truth to it. And, you know, again, you don't have to go to this extreme of cycle syncing with the moon, but we are pulled by the moon just like the tides. We're mostly water, and there is scientific. I know it sounds kind of woo and like, oh, astrology, I bet you're going to tell me you're a Libra too. And like, but I think there is a lot of actual evidence to it, and it has helped me as well. And I learned this from Kate Northrup, so I highly recommend following her if you're interested more in moon cycling. And she also obviously talks about menstrual cycles as well, but they sync up. And I just started using this app called Stardust, and it told me I'm a red witch because I bleed with the full moon. And I think you're maybe a white witch if you bleed at the new moon and different things. So, but it kind of helps you combine those methodologies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's all very, very interesting. And over the years, I have not been consistent. Sometimes I bleed with the full moon. Sometimes I ovulate with the full moon. But ironically, it seems like it's more often than not like happening around that time for me.
Yeah.
So that's totally unscientific. And then when I actually dove into the research, there was like a correlation where it was more significant than chance, where like women do tend to ovulate with the new moon or
full moon
or menstruate with one or the other. And obviously not everybody, and obviously not all the time, but there's a correlation there that is more significant than would be left to chance. So if you want the research, it is also there.
It exists.
If you need it.
There is cool, sorry to keep this going on now, but there is cool research too about like at the full moon, like hospital visits go up, like ER visits go up. There, like people get crazy during full moons.
And when do women give birth?
Yes.
And at night.
Exactly.
And yes. So there's all these things. So it's all very, but I guess the bottom line is that when you understand these rhythms and cycles within ourselves, our menstrual cycles, if you are curious about it, to just pay attention to the moon cycles as well. If you start to notice those patterns, it can help to make life more manageable instead of being hard on yourself when you don't have, you don't feel it that day, or you don't have the energy. Instead of being hard on yourself that you're not the same every day, like our circadian kind of man model. Mm-hmm. If you look at some of these other cycles, it can help you to understand better what is affecting you. And I mean, I hate to think that I'm affected by the moon and all that kind of stuff, and like my emotions aren't mine and all that stuff. But at the end of the day, like it does happen sometimes. And I did feel off during that lunar eclipse. Like, come on.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up today, I wanted to give you an opportunity to share what you do, your podcast, where people can go to find you, all of the good stuff.
Yeah, thank you so much. So my podcast is called Success with Soul, and Lisa was on it, so you can go listen to her episode first. And my blog is Root Revel. And so that is where I share kind of that holistic wellness, mind, body, soul, well-being. And because of my blog and then that becoming a full-time business for me, I now kind of I'm in the online course world. And so I have a course called the 6-Figure Blog Academy, and 21 Days to Impact is a new course that I just launched as well, helping women create profitable online businesses that align with their souls and fulfill their purpose. And it's amazing. I'm so grateful.
That is incredible. And what fulfilling work to be able to support women to build their businesses and things like that. I mean, I can't think of a quote off the top of my head, but I've heard many people say, like, if you can support the woman to bring money into the house, it changes the entire family. Of course, it also changes the family when men make money, but I feel like it's a bit different when we're able to support our families in that way. So thankful for you and what you do. And we'll be sure to link all of those places that you mentioned in the show notes page. So thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode over at fertilityfriday.com/354. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I really loved this conversation. This is one of those, it's one of those situations where it's obviously not ideal to come off of hormonal contraceptives and have a long delay in terms of when your first cycle comes back and have this extended period of time that it takes your body to normalize. But it is the reality for many women. Of course, it's not all women. And I'm always quick to point out that, again, the pill does not cause, quote unquote, fertility problems. It did not cause her PCOS. It was there to begin with. But when you're on hormonal contraceptives, what I always say is that if you were put on them because you never knew when your next period was coming, so if you were put on them because you had irregular cycles, you had, long cycles over 35 days on a consistent basis, and there was obviously some sort of problem, and you were put on the pill to, quote, regulate your cycles or normalize or whatever the buzzword that was used when you were put on it, you are at a higher risk of having certain challenges when you come off of it, because the pill doesn't fix those underlying problems. It simply, gives you a bleed every 28 days. And so if you are listening to this episode and you happen to be in that category, it's not always convenient to have to reassess your choice of birth control as we get older. But if you are planning to start a family within the next year or two, but you're not actively trying right now, and you're on hormonal contraceptives, and you know that you may fall into this risk category, it is extremely important that you consider what are the implications here. Do I have the ability to come off of the hormonal contraceptives? I would say if you have an actual issue like that you're aware of, I would recommend 18 months to 2 years. If not, at least 1 full year when you come off of it. Obviously you need another form of birth control. So whether you're using barrier methods or combining the barriers with fertility awareness, whatever the case is, it's really important for you to consider this. Because, as you heard in Kate's situation, it took about 2 years for her cycles to normalize. And that is not uncommon when you have an underlying issue that you're dealing with, because there can be a delay in the return of your first cycle. So there can be a delay in the return of ovulation when you were put on the pill because of cycle issues like this, or some women actually do develop those types of things while they're on birth control, but they wouldn't necessarily know because the pill is masking that. So if you fall into that kind of, quote, risk category, the first thing is that it can take a while for you to even start menstruating again. And then the second thing is that once you do start menstruating, whatever the issue that was underlying is still there. And so it often takes time to address that if you're looking to address it in a natural fashion. And the good news is that you can achieve healthy cycles. Your cycle is a reflection of health. So when if you come off the pill and you're in a situation similar to Kate, if you're listening to this episode because you are literally facing this right now, I think the good news is that you can restore normal cycling naturally. It is possible. It's not necessarily easy, and you often need support, right? You need to have the correct support, someone coming from a functional health perspective if you're looking to achieve this naturally. But it is possible, because once you restore your normal optimal health, the menstrual cycle follows suit. So hopefully this episode has been helpful, informative, and enlightening, and also has given you hope at the end of the tunnel to know that it is actually possible to achieve normal cycling, although it can take some time. So with that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you are tuning into today's episode. And of course, until next time, be well and happy starting.